Hello, everyone. So, for this chapter on chapter 15, part 2, we will be looking at the circulatory system, also called the transport system, in humans. And there'll be two videos for this particular part of the notes. So, the first video will cover the components of blood as we know it. Okay, you've heard a lot about blood. Blood is important for transporting substances around our body. So, what components are there in blood? So, that first video will cover that. Then, the second video will cover blood vessels. So, I'm sure you have learned from primary school the heart and the blood vessels are involved in pumping and transporting substances around the body. So, what types of blood vessels do we have in the human body? That will be the focus for the second video. Do ensure that you have watched both videos and understood the content in there. If need be, pause, rewatch, rewind so that you get the content. As you have seen from the previous chapter, you will need to rewatch the videos a number of times in order to reap the full benefits. As you go through the videos, also make it a point to take down my notes, think, and really try to remember some of the key facts that are emphasized on in the lecture. All right. Now, without further ado, let's start with the first lecture, which is on the components of blood. But before that, we need to think through why do we as humans need a transport system in the first place? Okay, now I'm sure you know we need to transport many things around the human body, such as oxygen gas, right? Oxygen needs to be transported from the lungs to the heart and from the heart to the other parts of the human body. So there is clearly a need for transporting oxygen. But why do you need a system with blood vessels for this? All right, so this is where we begin our study of the transport system. So we start off with a very simple question, which I've gotten you to do previously. Okay, we have learned that molecules are able to diffuse from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. But is diffusion alone sufficient, fast enough for transport of substances? So if we did the calculation, you can see that the distance between the lungs and toes is approximately 1.4 meters. So the time taken is 1.4 meters, which is the distance, divided by the speed. Now, this gives you approximately 13 hours. All right, approximately 13 hours. Of course, it will give you the answer in seconds and then you can convert the answer to hours. So you need about 13 hours to transport oxygen gas by diffusion from the lungs to your toes. Obviously, you don't have 13 hours for that. The muscle tissues inside your legs will need oxygen gas in order to work. So diffusion alone is not fast enough. Okay, I've just used the example of oxygen, but I could have used the example of other substances like glucose as well. Clearly, diffusion alone is not a fast enough mechanism. Diffusion actually is only for very short distances. So, what are the short distances that Mr. So is referring to? The short distances are from the capillary to the cells surrounding it. So you're talking about cells surrounding the capillary. That distance between the capillary and the cell is so short that usually the mechanism for movement of the particles is diffusion. But if you are transporting from organ to organ, like from the lung to the legs, okay, clearly diffusion alone wouldn't be sufficient. So this is why we need a transport system. This is because humans are multicellular organisms. We are made of more than one cell. We have many, many cells. In fact, we have many cells organized into tissues. Tissues are organized into organs, and we have so many organ systems which are located into different parts of the body. So we are multicellular and complex. So we are too big and too complex to rely on diffusion alone to transport substances around the body. And therefore, humans and plants as well, they need a transport system to efficiently transport substances such as oxygen and dissolved nutrients to cells that need these things. And also to transport products, waste materials away from the cells to be excreted and removed from the body. So this word excretion means removal. We will need to remove, for instance, urea from our body. Okay, and that also needs a transport system to transport urea away from the cells out of the human body. Okay, and this gives us the idea of a transport system. Now, the transport system in human bodies is also known as the circulatory system because it involves the heart pumping blood and the blood circulates around the human body. Now, other than called the circulatory system, we can also call it the cardiovascular system. So the word cardio refers to heart. So obviously the transport system, the circulatory system, or the cardiovascular system, the important organ is the heart, which pumps blood around the body. So cardio refers to the heart, and then vascular refers to vessels. Vessels are tubes, all right? So blood vessels are basically tubes that carry blood. It's like pipes or tubes. Okay, so cardiovascular system refers to the heart and the blood vessels, which of course is involved in transporting substances. Okay, so that is the idea why we need a transport system. You will need to know the reason, the rationale behind why a transport system is important, is necessary, it's like necessary and essential for humans. Okay, now not just humans, but any multicellular organism such as plants. Plants also have a very elaborate transport system, which we will learn about in the next part of the notes. Okay, now let's move on. So I believe you have learned blood before. You know that blood is a tissue. This one you learned last year. Now blood is a tissue, so let's revise. Last year we have learned cell. So for example, a cell could be red blood cell. Red blood cell is a cell. Many cells are organized into a tissue. Tissues are organized into organs. And finally, different organs are organized into organ systems. So this is the hierarchy, the level from smallest and simplest to, of course, the most complicated, which is actually organism, is the whole living thing. Organism, all right, is the largest and most complex. Okay, so this is just a revision from cells last year where you had learned cell, tissue, organ systems, and organism. Okay, so now let's look at the components of blood. Now, blood is very important. You might know that blood carries oxygen, but specifically, which component of blood carries and transports oxygen? It's the red blood cells. Now, red blood cells are the most plentiful component of your blood. So your blood is mostly, in terms of cells, red blood cells. All right. Now, red blood cells contain a red pigment called hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a red colored pigment. Pigments are colored substances. All right. So pigment means colored substance. All right. Now, hemoglobin binds to oxygen. This is the most important function of hemoglobin. It binds to oxygen, it attaches itself to oxygen, and therefore it allows the red blood cells to transport oxygen to different parts of the body. Now, in order to do this, clearly your red blood cell must have a lot of hemoglobin. If the red blood cell cannot contain as much hemoglobin as possible, then it can't transport oxygen efficiently. Okay, so the idea is hemoglobin is the substance, the pigment in red blood cells, and red blood cells must have a lot of hemoglobin. So how do red blood cells actually squeeze in so much hemoglobin? There are some functions. Now, the first adaptation of red blood cell is red blood cells have no nucleus. Okay, unlike typical animal cells, red blood cells do not have a nucleus. Because red blood cells have no nucleus, there is more space to accommodate or fill in or contain more hemoglobin. So that's the idea. The absence of a nucleus frees up the space in the red blood cells to actually contain more hemoglobin. Okay? Now, next, you might notice that over here there's this word concave surface. Now, please cancel that out. It's actually a flat biconcave. It's not just concave, but flat biconcave surface. So red blood cells have a unique shape. It's what I call a donut shape. Okay, but it's a donut that's flat in the center. All right, so it has a flat biconcave surface or shape. So what is this flat biconcave shape used for? So this is an adaptation of the red blood cell to actually allow it to increase this familiar concept called surface area to volume ratio for efficient oxygen binding and release and transport. So again, we return to this idea of surface area to volume ratio. By having a flat biconcave shape, that means it's actually curving inwards on both sides. It increases the surface area to volume ratio for very efficient binding to oxygen, releasing oxygen, as well as transporting oxygen. So the idea is to increase surface area to volume ratio. All right. So these are the two structural adaptations of red blood cells and how they allow the red blood cells to perform its function. Okay, now these are useful to know, so I would advise that we learn this, given that red blood cells are already the majority of cells in the blood. Okay, now the next type of cells in the blood, which is not in the textbook sadly, is white blood cells. Now, white blood cells are very easy to identify, even without a colored diagram. You can identify white blood cells in blood super easily. How do you tell? White blood cells have a nucleus, and the nucleus has an interesting shape. All right, there are two types of white blood cells, broadly speaking. Actually, there are more, but broadly speaking, there are two types. One has a rounded nucleus, very nice, very rounded. The other one has a lobed nucleus. Now, what is lobe? Lobe means, for example, this one has one lobe, two lobe, three lobes. It's a lobed nucleus. Now, a lobed nucleus usually looks like a U shape. It's not a round, but it's a U shape nucleus. All right. Now, U shape is not a proper scientific term. I'm only teaching you this so that you can identify it more easily from a diagram. Okay, so there are two types of white blood cells actually. Okay, one with a lobed nucleus and one with a round nucleus. All right, now what do white blood cells do? Broadly speaking, white blood cells defend against infections by bacteria and viruses. They defend our body against foreign infections. Okay, how do they do that? Now, white blood cells can defend our body against infections through two ways. First way is to produce chemicals called antibodies. These are chemicals that actually bind to and then destroy the bacteria and viruses. So this is by producing chemicals called antibodies. The second way is actually even more direct, is to actually engulf, swallow up. Okay, so engulf the bacteria and viruses. They swallow up the bacteria and viruses and actually engulf and digest and destroy the bacteria and viruses. All right, so this process of engulfing bacteria and viruses and destroying them is called phagocytosis. Phagocytosis means it's literally eating up the bacteria. All right, it's engulfing and then digesting the bacteria and viruses. Okay, so there are two types of mechanisms through which white blood cells work. And actually, from the shape of the nucleus, you can tell which is which. Okay, the one that produces antibodies is the one with the round nucleus. This is called a lymphocyte. Okay, lymphocyte produces antibodies. Okay, and then we have the lobed nucleus. The lobed nucleus is called phagocyte. And I'm sure you can predict phagocytes carry out phagocytosis, where they actually engulf the bacteria and viruses and swallow them up, literally. Okay, now you don't have to know these words, phagocytes and lymphocytes. At Sec 2, you just need to know that white blood cells defend our body against infection. In fact, white blood cells are part of the immune system. The immune system actually protects our body from infections. So this part of the immune system. So you can imagine without functioning white blood cells, the immune system becomes weakened, and that is a problem for the human body. When your immune system is weak, you actually get infections more easily. You're more vulnerable. If you are more vulnerable to infections, you will fall sick more easily. You get fever, you will get flu, cold, cough much more easily than others with a stronger immune system. Okay, so that is the white blood cells, which have a nucleus, and the nucleus has a very unique shape. And depending on the shape, you can actually work out how do these white blood cells protect and defend our body against infections. The next type of cells, but not true cells, are called platelets. Now, platelets are cell fragments found in blood. So they are fragments of cells, meaning they are not living whole cells. Okay, so they were actually cell fragments that were broken down from cells that had once been alive. Okay, but platelets, even though they are fragments, they are still very important because they are involved in the clotting of blood. So, for example, if you injure yourself accidentally and you get a cut, the cut will clot eventually, right? The blood doesn't continue flowing out forever. At some point, the blood actually clots, and this blood clotting is very crucial because it actually helps to stop the bleeding, right? Clotting of blood stops the bleeding, stops the loss of red blood cells from the blood. Second important role of clotting of blood is that it prevents infections by sealing the wound. All right. So clotting of blood has two important functions. One is to stop the loss of blood, and two is to seal the wound. If the wound is not sealed properly, bacteria could enter, and that could cause infections and complications later on. So it's very important to actually clot the blood whenever there is an injury and then parts of the tissue is exposed to the air. Okay, so platelets are very important, even though they are fragments of cells, because they help to perform this important function of clotting of blood. Now, without platelets, your blood will not clot, and then you will suffer an excessive loss of blood. That's obviously not good. If you lose too much blood, okay, you will lose consciousness, you will faint. Okay, and why do you faint? Later on, we will take a look. And finally, let's not ignore the last part is called plasma. Now, plasma is not cells. Plasma is an aqueous solution. Aqueous means dissolved in water. So plasma is basically the solution portion of blood, and plasma is about 55% of blood. So actually most of the blood is plasma. Okay, but plasma is not cells. Plasma is just a solution which transports water, dissolve nutrients. Dissolve is a very important word here. The nutrients must be dissolved in the water because this is a solution. So what can dissolve in water? Glucose, amino acids, these are soluble. They can dissolve in water. All right. You notice I've not mentioned fats because fats are insoluble in water actually. So fats are actually transported by a different system which we do not learn. Okay, fats are transported by the lymphatic system. Okay, you can read it up if you are interested. Now, besides nutrients, what else is transported? We have dissolved mineral salts and waste products. So waste products is something that we spoke about just now. So what waste products do we have? We have carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, even though it's a gas, is actually transported in the plasma. All right. So carbon dioxide is transported in the plasma because carbon dioxide gas can dissolve in water. All right, so CO2, carbon dioxide, dissolves in water to some extent, and therefore CO2 is transported in the plasma. There are also enzymes in the plasma that help convert carbon dioxide to a more soluble form of carbon dioxide, but you will learn that later on in Sec 3. Besides carbon dioxide, there's also urea. Urea is a very important waste product that a lot of the cells produce. Urea can be produced by many things, but the main thing that produces urea is when amino acids are broken down. Okay, so amino acids can be broken down to form urea. Okay, and that's why you need to remove urea from the cells because urea in higher concentrations when it accumulates is toxic. Okay, so this little checkpoint here, which components of blood transports oxygen? Okay, I think we should know that by now. The component that transports oxygen is the red blood cells, because the red blood cells contain hemoglobin, which binds to and transports oxygen around the body. Next, which component of blood transports carbon dioxide? It's not the red blood cells, it's not like oxygen. carbon dioxide can dissolve in water. So carbon dioxide is actually transported in the plasma of the blood. Okay, so ensure you've completed page 3. I know page 3 is a very content heavy page, but let's learn to do it properly. All right, and we're going to move on to page 4, which is somewhat enrichment. Okay, but I'll still cover it. Okay, so page 4, enrichment. So now let's look at some issues involving the individual components of blood. Issues meaning diseases, problems. So first one, red blood cells. What happens when you have too little red blood cells? Okay, now this is a possible condition. Sometimes due to diet, we may not have eaten enough iron in our diet. Lack of iron could cause too few red blood cells to form. Okay, so usually malnutrition, okay, a poor diet could cause too few red blood cells to be formed. So when you have too few red blood cells, you get this condition called anemia. Anemia is a condition where there are too few red blood cells. So what are some symptoms of anemia? How would you answer this? You would think, if there are too few red blood cells, what is the impact of this? What's the consequence? You already know red blood cells contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin binds to and transports oxygen, right? So that is the function of red blood cells, to contain a red pigment called hemoglobin that binds to and transports oxygen around the body. So now you have too few red blood cells means you cannot bind to and transport oxygen as efficiently as before. You transport less oxygen than before. So how will this impact anemia patients? Well, first, less oxygen is transported round the body, right? To the other parts of the body. Now, what are the other parts of the body? The other parts of the body could include your hands and legs, could include the brain. So all these will be affected. So anemia patients actually feel tired because the brain is not working as well as before. Okay, but besides being tired, you also have dizziness. All right. So basically, when you have less oxygen transported to the brain it doesn't work as actively as before. So you feel dizzy, you feel tired. Okay. But what else? You also feel numbness in the limbs. Limbs meaning hands and legs. So the hands and legs actually receive less oxygen than before. So the cells, the muscles in the hands and legs will not function as well as before. Okay. Now you must be able to work out symptoms of the disease if I tell you what the disease is. All right. So take this as an application exercise in biology. If you wanted to work out what are the symptoms of this disease, let's think through. This disease is due to too few red blood cell. So what do you learn about red blood cell? Think back. Always think back to what you have learned. So red blood cells contain hemoglobin that binds to and transports oxygen. Write it out. Whatever you revise, you write it out first. Then now you reason it out. Oh, because there's too little hemoglobin, too little red blood cell, that's why less oxygen is transported. Transported to the brain, transported to the hand, to the legs. Therefore, you can deduce that, oh, the brain will not function as well as before. You will feel dizzy, tired, okay? And in severe circumstances, you could lose consciousness. Okay, that means you faint. Okay, so one main reason for fainting is when there's too little red blood cell left in the blood, which could be caused due to excess bleeding. If there's excessive bleeding from the wound, you lose too many red blood cells, that's when you lose consciousness because you have too few red blood cells to transport oxygen. Next, white blood cells. Now, white blood cells, there's too few and too many. So let's look at too few first. So too few white blood cells, what happens? So again, you need to know what is the function of white blood cells. The function of white blood cells is to defend against infection by bacteria and viruses. So if you have too few white blood cells, it means your body is cannot defend against infections. So in such circumstances where your body cannot defend against infections as effectively as before, the body is said to be immunocompromised. That means your immune system is weaker than before. So other people could withstand and defend against infections. So other people don't fall sick so easily. But an immunocompromised patient who has very few white blood cells cannot. So the patient who is immunocompromised falls sick very easily. A common cold or cough could be very severe for this particular patient. So what are the primary causes for this condition? The primary causes of this condition are: first cause could possibly be a virus called the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. So HIV is a virus that's a sexually transmitted virus. So it's transmitted either through sexual intercourse or blood. All right. Now, HIV is a virus that infects white blood cells and destroys them. So patients who have HIV infection, the white blood cells are no longer existent because they have been destroyed by the virus. So you can imagine HIV kills the patient because the patient has no more white blood cells left to fight against the infections. Okay, so you may have heard of HIV before. Now, HIV causes the disease called AIDS. Now, AIDS is called acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So it's a very big word, but actually, if you think about it, immunodeficiency simply means your body doesn't have a strong immune system to fight against infections. And that's because HIV has infected the white blood cells and destroyed the white blood cells. Now, another reason besides HIV infection that could kill white blood cells is chemotherapy. So, chemotherapy is prescribed to patients with cancer. So in chemotherapy, how it works is that the patient will eat certain chemicals that kills cells. In particular, it kills dividing cells, cells that are growing and dividing. So cancerous cells obviously grow and divide very fast, but so do white blood cells. White blood cells grow and divide very, very quickly as well. So because the chemicals cannot differentiate cancer cells and white blood cell, it will kill both. All right, it's like a sword that kills both. You know, the thing that you want to kill, the monster that you want to kill, plus another monster. So it's killing both the cancerous cells and the white blood cells. So the chemotherapy treatment actually kills off the white blood cells, and that's why patients who have just gone through chemotherapy are advised to not go out so often. Because when they go out, they may be exposed to bacteria and viruses, and their bodies are already immunocompromised. If their bodies are immunocompromised, they have too few white blood cells, they may not be able to withstand with infections. Okay? Now, the next problem is when there are too many white blood cells. That's also a problem in itself. All right? So, when the white blood cell count is very high, higher than normal, too many, that is usually a sign that the body is actually experiencing an acute, a very severe infection that's fighting off. So one way the doctors can tell whether you are sick, whether you have a viral infection, is do a blood test. By doing a blood test, they can count the number of white blood cells. If there are too many white blood cells, it's usually a sign, a signal to you that, okay, the body is actually experiencing an infection and we need to try to do something to help the body fight off this infection. Okay. Now, besides that, a higher than normal white blood cell count could also be a sign of cancer of the blood. Now, cancer of the blood is called leukemia. So, leukemia is a situation, is a disease where the white blood cells divide uncontrollably and grow uncontrollably. Okay, so leukemia, specifically speaking, is a cancer of white blood cells, where the white blood cells continue to divide non-stop, uncontrollably. Okay, obviously leukemia is very dangerous. It's cancerous. It might migrate to other parts of the body, you know, the cancer. So that is a dangerous disease in itself. All right. So an early sign of leukemia is actually too many white blood cells. Finally, platelets. Now, platelets, what is the issue with too few platelets? So again, we think through. Platelets are for clotting of blood. Okay. So if there are too few platelets, the blood cannot clot as quickly. So if the blood cannot clot, the blood will continue to flow out if there is a cut or a wound. So this could result in a massive loss of blood. A massive loss of blood is called hemorrhage. A hemorrhage is a situation whereby blood is being lost at a very, very fast rate from the body. All right. Now, hemorrhage is dangerous because you are losing blood very quickly. When you lose blood, you lose a lot of red blood cells. So you go back. If you lose too many red blood cells, you have so few red blood cells left, you get anemia. But worse still, you could go into shock and lose consciousness. All right. So for those of us who are learning first aid in NCDCC, you might have learned these words: shock and loss of consciousness. This happens when there's a massive loss of blood, which is called a hemorrhage. Now, hemorrhages can be caused by many things, but one of the reasons is lack of platelets. Now, the low level of platelets could be caused by a few things. Dengue fever. Dengue fever is a disease whereby the platelets are destroyed. Okay, so the particular bacteria that the particular virus that causes dengue fever actually not kills off but destroys the platelets. Remember, platelets are not living cells, so they can't be killed, they are destroyed. Okay, so dengue fever actually decreases the amount of platelets. And that's how people tell, the doctors can tell when you have dengue fever. They do a blood test. When they do a blood test for you and the platelet count is very low, that tells the doctor, oh, this person has dengue fever. Dengue fever is very dangerous, not because of the fever, you know. Dengue fever is dangerous because the blood cannot clot as quickly. So the patient with dengue fever could suffer hemorrhage, and that is particularly dangerous. Now, there are also certain diseases whereby it's genetically inherited from parents. So, like a disease called hemophilia. Hemophilia is an inherited disease from parents due to an error in the genetic material of the cells. So, in this particular patient with hemophilia, they cannot produce platelets, or if the platelets are produced, they are destroyed immediately. And that's why there are very few platelets in hemophilia patients. Okay? Now, this is enrichment. Having said that, if you notice, we can actually test you these diseases to actually test whether you can apply your knowledge of the component of blood and its function, right? To test you on platelets, I need not ask you what are platelets, you know. I could test you what happens if you have too few platelets. Suggest what happens. So can you apply your knowledge? So again, this page, while it's enrichment, is good to know. See whether you are able to make the link between the component of blood, what it does, and how it impacts the patients if there's too few or too many of this component. Now, finally, let's go on to the last page for this lecture. How can the components of blood be separated? Now, the components of blood are separated by a technique called centrifugation. Now, what is centrifugation? Basically, you spin tubes of blood. So you put blood into tubes. You can see this is the blood test tube, right? So you put the blood into test tubes and then you spin them at high speed in a machine called a centrifuge. Now, when you spin the blood or any mixture at high speeds, it tends to separate into layers based on density. All right. Now the machine, the centrifuge looks like this. This is the centrifuge that I've highlighted in blue over here. So it just spins the test tubes at very high speeds, and then it separates based on densities. So now the results are shown here. You can see, based on this, you can tell the highest density sinks to the bottom. So red blood cells have the highest density, whereas plasma have the lowest density. Okay. Next, the height of the layers also tells you how much do you have in the blood. Red blood cells are approximately 41% of blood. Plasma is approximately 55% of blood. This leaves white blood cells and platelet at 4% of the blood by volume. All right, you don't have to know the percentages. I'm just telling you the percentages. All right, so you can see that red blood cells are the most abundant cells because plasma is not a cell. Plasma got 55%, but it's not cells. So cells is red blood cells. Okay. Finally, you might be wondering, where do all these blood cells even come from? Where do the white blood cells come from? Red blood cells come from? Now, our blood cells come from the bone marrow. All right. So all the blood cells, be it red blood cells or white blood cells or platelets as well, come from the bone marrow. The bone marrow is a very soft tissue inside the bone itself. So bones are hard, but in the middle of the bone is a soft tissue called bone marrow. Now, bone marrow is very, very important because it contains what we call multipotent stem cells. So you might have heard of this word stem cell, stem cell. What is the meaning of stem cell? Stem cells are cells that are not specialized, which is quite interesting because most cells are specialized. Most cells have different shapes, have different functions, right? So specialized means different shape, different functions. But stem cells are not like that. Stem cells do not have different shapes, they do not have different functions. And what's interesting is stem cells can go on to form differentiated cells. So you can think of stem cells as the precursor, the origin of the differentiated cells that we have. So the bone marrow contains multipotent stem cells which differentiate to form red blood cells and white blood cells. And this is the reason why patients with leukemia very often need a bone marrow transplant. They get leukemia because their bone marrow is no longer functioning normally. It's either dividing too rapidly, all right, or dividing until it doesn't work anymore. So the bone marrow is the problem in leukemia patients. To solve the problem of leukemia, you need a bone marrow transplant. Okay, that means you need to take someone else's bone marrow and put it inside the patient. Okay, now before we end this lecture, something else that's quite interesting to take note of for white blood cells is white blood cells defend against infections, as we learned on page 3. But the white blood cells are also involved in tissue rejection, in organ transplants. So we just spoke about bone marrow transplant. Can you really take anyone's bone marrow and transplant it into you? The answer is no, you can't. All right. The bone marrow of an individual has its own genetic code that's tied to the person. All right. If you were to take a foreign bone marrow from a totally unrelated person, it may not be compatible with your body. Meaning, your body's own white blood cells, your body's own immune system could recognize this foreign bone marrow as a foreign invader and destroy and reject the bone marrow that's transplanted into you. All right. So white blood cells actually are the reason why tissues and organs are rejected during transplants. And this is why before doing a transplant, you must find a matching donor who's compatible in terms of blood type, in terms of cells. Okay, it must be compatible. If it's not compatible, the organs, such as the kidney, the liver, or in this case, bone marrow, could be rejected. And that obviously causes the operation to fail. Okay, so we have finished up to page 5 of this set of notes on the components of blood. In the next lecture video, we will look at page 6 till page 9, which is about the blood vessels and the heart. So please I'll see you in the next lecture video. Please continue to rewatch this if you have any questions. Okay, thank you.